I'm glad you can all join us tonight. At Trinity, we have a genuine desire to progress the well-being of our first Australians, and also to learn from their culture and stories so that we can actually improve. So based on that, or as such, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the traditional custodians of the land where I'm coming from to you from tonight in Hawthorne, but also pay my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us this evening. So thank you to for joining us at this year's Gourlay Business Ethics Panel discussion. This was an initiative of the wonderful and late John Gourlay back in 2004, and John set this this series, or this an idea of having a visiting professor in business ethics, with the intent of actually making students and also business leaders to have in the forefront of their mind some ethics and values when making decisions, because he was concerned at the time that those ethics and business decisions, those ethics and values weren't being put into business decisions. And so he's very kindly, very generously, and with a lot of foresight, put this into play. So we've been running this since 2004. We're lucky enough tonight to have members of, as I look around the Zoom, members of John's family with us. We have Louise Gourlay, we have Emma Harrison, Andrew Gourlay, Will Gourlay, and I think I saw Jono as well, and their family. So thank you very much, Gourlay family, for being with us tonight, but also for your support with all of these particular events that we've had over the past years and again this year. And also, we'd like to acknowledge John this evening for his wonderful, generous gift that's made this all possible. Now, Ben, there you are. Ben, I'd like to introduce Associate Professor Ben Neville. Ben's going to introduce the speakers on the panel tonight, but also facilitate the discussion. Ben is the Gourlay Fellow of Ethics in Business. He is an Associate Professor in Management and Marketing in the Faculty of Economics and Business at the University of Melbourne. And he's also the Deputy Director of Melbourne Climate Futures. Ben, I'm going to hand over to you now to introduce our speakers and then facilitate a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scotty. And yes, welcome to everybody this evening, and especially a warm welcome to the members of the Gourlay family. And I'll reiterate what you said, Scotty, to acknowledge their gift and the continued support of the visiting professorship. And obviously I research and teach in this area, so I fully support their intent to contribute to more ethical business in Melbourne, Australia, and elsewhere around the world. I'd also like to reiterate, as you said, Scotty, to acknowledge the First Nations people and pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land. I'm also on Wurundjeri country, and so I pay my respects to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. And I think it's especially important to acknowledge that when we are talking about a topic such as modern slavery, that we do acknowledge that in Australia we have a history of causing egregious harms to our First Nations people, and that has included slavery and genocide. But I also hope that we're getting to a more mature phase in our development and our relationship where we are becoming ready to face up to these harms and bring healing to our relationship so that we can all move forward together. And I think the acknowledgement of country has been a really important and successful contribution to Australian culture for this reason. So this evening we will be discussing another quite difficult topic, modern slavery, which does exist within our supply chains and contributes slavery footprint, and into details about what I buy and consume. And they estimated that there were approximately 38 slaves involved in making the products that I consume. So this is an endemic issue, and we have all been complicit. But I hope that after you've been involved in this conversation this evening, that you are also left with a sense that the problem is being positively dealt with, and business and others. And while there is still a lot of work to do, we are on a pathway towards effectively dealing with this problem. So we will have about 35 minutes of conversation, and then we'll open it up for about 10 minutes of Q&A from the audience. So at that point, yeah, it might be best if you use the hand function, and so that we can note who would like to ask a question, and then introduce yourself, and then you can ask your question. So now to introduce our panelists. So firstly, we have Professor Andy Crane from Bath University in the UK. So Andy is the attempted Gourlay Visiting Professor of Ethics in Business. We've tried to bring Andy out last year and again this year. I'm trying to line up a visit, but of course COVID has gotten in the way and kept the borders closed. But we are very hopeful that we'll be able to bring him to Melbourne next year in May. And Ken Hinchcliffe will talk a little bit about our exciting plans for next year at the end of this session. So Andy's work in ethical business has especially addressed the changing role of the corporation in the global economy, introducing a notion of the political roles and responsibilities of business. He's also focused on how ideas of ethics, freedom and responsibility are communicated and managed by corporations, consumers and other stakeholders. He's addressed specific application areas of corporate responsibility, including competitive intelligence, responsible marketing, non-profit partnerships, and responsibilities to children. However, the area that he's become most well known for is on forced labour and modern slavery. I think it's fair to describe him as the world's leading business academic. Howard. Alex worked for 8 years for the Australian government, leading the development and implementation of Australia's landmark Modern Slavery Act 2018, Australia's national response to modern slavery. Alex has also delivered modern slavery training to foreign governments and appeared as an expert government witness at parliamentary inquiries. Now working with the consultancy Pillar 2, Alex has extensive experience supporting companies to address modern slavery risks. Our third speaker is Laura Gaspert, who is the Ethical Sourcing Manager at Bunnings, and before that was the Ethical Sourcing Manager at Coles. Both companies have enormous numbers of products to keep track of, with very complex supply chains that extend across political borders. So Laura has a very tough job, but it will be wonderful to hear insights from her about what large corporations are doing on this problem. So if I can ask, Andy, if I can ask you the first question, can you please tell us what is modern slavery and where is it most endemic?
Good evening, everybody. Thanks, Ben, for the introduction. And this is in some ways it should be a very simple question, I think, what is modern slavery? But there's lots of complexities in this. And I think when we think about slavery, we tend to think about historical forms of slavery where it was fairly straightforward, right? We had people that were bought and sold, but there was a kind of legal transaction that took place. And so it was very clear. We had documentation to show who was in slavery and who was not. And there was a whole legal apparatus to support that. When we talk about modern slavery, we're talking about something that's similar but different in important ways, right? That we very rarely have this situation where we have people that are literally bought and sold. Sometimes there may be a buying and selling of the debt that they're involved in, but very rarely the person themselves. So what are we talking about? So what we're really trying to get at with the idea of modern slavery is people who are in a situation that is like or akin to them being controlled or owned by somebody. So if you can treat somebody as if you own them, therefore you're in a potential situation of perpetrating modern slavery. And when we talk about this in a business context, we're often talking about situations of exploitation where somebody is being exploited, and we have exploitation of all kinds, in all kinds of jobs, in all kinds of situations. Many of us have probably been exploited in different ways in the kind of work that we've done. And there are kind of degrees of exploitation. So what we're trying to do with modern slavery is trying to discern what's at the extreme level where people are in kind of very extreme forms of exploitation. But crucially, the big difference is that they can't leave. They can't refuse to do work, right? They're in a forced labor type of situation. And the reason for this is because they're threatened, because there's violence against them, because they've been deceived, whether it's through coercion or some other abuse of power. So when we talk about modern slavery, we're talking about a whole range of things. It tends to be used as something of an umbrella term, including things like trafficking, which is more about the movement of people into these situations, of forced labor, forced sex work, of forced child labor. And sometimes we also include things such as forced marriage, child soldiers, and other sorts of things. But in the work situation, we typically are talking about forced labor. But where exactly we draw that line between, let's call it regular exploitation, and an extreme form of exploitation of modern slavery, it's never black and white. And sometimes people move in and out of these situations. Sometimes it may be that there are some characteristics of modern slavery in the situation that they're in, but other parts of it are not. So it can become very difficult. And we can look at, so the International Labour Organization has a set of, I think it's 11 indicators that we can look at to give a sense of the sorts of things that might suggest that somebody's in one of these situations. And if you have several of these indicators, then it's likely that somebody's in a forced labor situation. Things like whether their wages are withheld or not paid at all, whether they're in debt bondage, which means that they have to keep paying off a debt, and they have a contract of work that lasts for as long as they're going to be in debt, so they can't leave. Whether their identity documents have been taken away and retained by their employer, whether they're a victim of physical or sexual violence, whether they're restricted in their movements in some way, if they're locked in, for example. So we've got a whole set of things that we can see as kind of indicators of this type of situation. And it's very difficult to determine exactly how many people are in these situations. It tends to be something that is not easily observed. It's not something that many people will be able to, you can't just do a survey and find out very easily how many people are in these situations. So we don't know exactly how many people are in modern slavery type situations, but we know it's an order of millions, tens of millions of people. The most recent estimate, I think, put it about 41 million. But that's a very broad estimate. We know it's in tens of millions, which will include in Australia probably tens of thousands, possibly, of people. So that's the kind of broad contours of what we're talking about, Ben. And it's never straightforward to define this, but I think at the same time, we also get a sense that I think when we talk about modern slavery, we know in our minds kind of what sort of situations we're talking about, right? People in very, very extreme situations of exploitation.
Are there particular industries and product categories where slavery seems to be most prevalent?
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways of looking at that. In one sense, when we think about how let's say you mentioned your estimation of how many slaves are working for you. So if we think about the supply chain aspects, there are certain supply chains that are more or less likely to have slavery in them. They typically are ones associated with food, with electronics, and with clothes. So if you eat food, have a computer or phone, or wear clothes, you probably have some modern slavery in the supply chain of the products that you use, which is all of us, right? It's going to be every single one of us. And if you're an organization that deals with any of those things, right? If you produce food or if you serve food, If you use computers or any form of IT, if you have any kind of uniforms or you sell clothes, you're going to be involved in these situations. But there are also forms of slavery which perhaps don't get into global supply chains, right? Things that may happen, things like brick making, for example, in countries like Pakistan, has been very well documented, having a modern slavery problem. But these won't end up necessarily in the global supply chain of bricks. They'll just be used locally. So we have to also think about what's happening, both kind of what's happening in kind of global industries, but also what's happening locally.
Yeah, thank you. Alex, if I can ask you, you were centrally involved in the Australian government legislation. So can you tell us what it sets out for businesses and what it's trying to achieve?
Sure, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. As Andrew was saying, it's really important to think about modern slavery in the context of the way that we engage with it as consumers. And so, whether it's the fruit and vegetables in your kitchen that might have been picked by exploited labor here in Australia, or the cotton in the shirt you're wearing, or the conflict minerals in the electronics we're using, we know that modern slavery is really deeply embedded in the global economy. And in Australia, there's a piece of legislation called the Modern Slavery Act that tries to challenge and rectify that dynamic. And what the legislation does is it applies to large businesses and other large entities in Australia, such as charities that have $100 million in annual consolidated revenue and that are either Australian entities or that are carrying on business here in Australia, so engaged with the Australian economy. And what our Modern Slavery Act requires of these entities is that they prepare something called an annual modern slavery statement. And a modern slavery statement is a document that needs to be, if you're a company, signed by a director and approved by the board. And that statement, which is produced every year, explains the steps that a particular business is taking to assess and address modern slavery risks in its global operations and its supply chain. So it needs to talk about a set of mandatory criteria that are set out in the Act. And that covers both the risks and the actions that it's taking in regards to modern slavery, but also things like how it's checking and how it's measuring the effectiveness of the actions that it's taking. So if a business goes off and does a range of things like addressing modern slavery through contract clauses and supplier engagement and supply chain mapping, it's also meant to be thinking about whether or not this is working. And all this information is packaged up into a modern slavery statement approved at the senior levels of the business and submitted to the Australian government, where it's published on an online website called a Modern Slavery Register. And this year has been quite significant for this Modern Slavery Act, because although the law was passed in 2018 and it came into force in 2019, we've only just reached the point where every business required to report under the law has now done so for the first time. And so if you head to a website called modernslaveryregister.gov.au, you'll see that there's now around 2,500 modern slavery statements from companies and other organizations headquartered in over 40 countries. And some of the most common sectors for those statements are the largest facets of our economy, so extractives and mining, finance and real estate, and construction. And this legislation is really significant, and we can talk a little bit more about the theory behind it, but because Australia is one of the few countries to have taken this approach to tackling modern slavery, both in business operations and supply chains here within our borders, but also more globally. And it builds on some similar legislation in the United Kingdom in 2015, and also some earlier legislation in California in 2010. And it's now part of this kind of large tidal wave of regulation and government legislation that's aimed at trying to ensure that businesses respect human rights, including modern slavery, in the business activities that they undertake. So it's a really significant piece of legislation in the context both of what's happening here in Australia and how our businesses are tackling modern slavery, but also in the context of this much broader business move, global move, to try and work out, well, how do we actually make sure that the businesses that are part of our global supply chains are doing the right thing?
Yeah, Thanks, Alex. And you can go onto that website and find the University of Melbourne's modern slavery statement as well. We spend $1.2 billion each year on stuff. So yeah, there's certainly some sort of motivation to try and identify modern slavery. But Alex, like with these statements, they organizations might decide that, they might look at it for 5 seconds and then say, we haven't found anything here, and they can publish it, and that's good enough. So has it really been effective?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think at one level, the answer to that is maybe it's either too early to tell, or it's just really hard to tell, because as Andrew said, we don't even really have a good sense of how many people are trapped in modern slavery around the world. We know it's tens of millions, but if we don't even know that as a baseline, then how do we go about actually measuring the effectiveness of what we're asking businesses to do? But we can say a couple of things. We can say the legislation has certainly, I think, radically increased business awareness of modern slavery here in Australia. And certainly it's created an environment where, for the first time, businesses are making often conscious choices about whether this is an issue that they will respond to, and how they'll respond to that. And so it may be that there are boards, and there are of some companies that have chosen to take a very minimal approach to this. And then there are also other companies that have said, look, this is the platform that we need to really take meaningful action to respond to this legislation. And you can see the modern slavery statements on the register, and the quality of those statements really reflect that dynamic. So there'll be some statements that are basically a Word document, and they're 1 or 2 pages, and there's some much longer statements that show a real commitment from businesses to respond to this issue. So it's certainly having an impact, but the real challenge now and into the future is going to be tracking that impact back down into global supply chains, and for example, working out for people in brick kilns, in parts of Asia, for people in textile supply chains, for people on fishing vessels who may be catching our seafood. Is the world a better place for them, and are they safer because of legislation like this?
Yeah, great. And I think one of the perhaps unrecognised sort of elements to this legislation is that it does bring it up to the board level. And so now the board does need to address it, whereas before they could sort of leave it to their CSR department or sustainability department, and just never really gets onto the to-do list. Now, Laura, if I can move to you, how do you try to stamp out modern slavery through ethical sourcing at Bunnings?
Oh, thank you. And what a great introduction from Andrew and Alexander to really set the scene. Bunnings has considered sort of ethical procurement of goods and services, and particularly modern slavery, a really material business risk for a number of years. We've had an ethical sourcing program in place since 2016 and have released 6 modern slavery statements. So this is a really keen material risk for us. My role, and I'm supported by a team to help implement this, is to really govern the procurement of goods and services. Our supply chains are incredibly complicated. To put some numbers around this, we deal with around 950 suppliers annually, and that will flex up and down depending on season and demand, and deal with over 30 countries. So what we do as a team is we have governance set in place. So we've got ethical sourcing codes of conduct, which are embedded within trading terms, which allow us the rights to suspend or terminate contracts if suppliers fail to meet our requirements. So that's kind of the teeth to our program. But on the surface, what we do is we engage with third-party experts to go and conduct on-site, sort of boots on the ground reviews of these manufacturing sites to understand what the working conditions are in these countries. And then we report on that annually so that our stakeholders understand exactly where we're at in our journey and how we're going in terms of upholding human rights and addressing modern slavery risks.
Yeah, fantastic. Do you have any particular examples of what you've done when you've identified modern slavery with a supplier?
Just as Andrew said, modern slavery is a spectrum, and it's clandestine in nature, which means it's very challenging to identify You're very rarely going to get a report where someone has identified forced or bonded labour. And what you do find is you have reports which indicate or suspect that deception, restriction of movement, restriction of freedom is occurring. And so in those instances, our first intention is to lean into the issue and work with our supplier to remediate. It's really important as a business that we address these issues as they arise. We know the risks and we have remediation processes in place that put the victim at the centre of how we respond. So we know that if we exit the supply chain, that individual is probably in a more vulnerable position than if we were to stay and support their way into improved working conditions. And that could be a number of different avenues. That could be returning their passports to them, ensuring that they have safe passage home, ensuring that they are paid whatever outstanding amount is owed to them, ensuring that their working conditions are safe. So there's a number of different avenues that we do, and we'll work with the supplier along that corrective action process to ensure those issues are resolved.
Great. And so you said that you work across 30 different countries. So COVID has made working internationally very difficult. How's that impacted the work that you've done?
Hugely. I think in two really big aspects for us, I'd say that the risk of modern slavery, the risk of vulnerable workers being exploited is absolutely heightened in this COVID era. Supply chains are incredibly disrupted. We know that manufacturers and suppliers' profitability is challenged during this time. And then that has a flow-on consequence for working hours, wages, health and safety conditions. So we know that the risk of modern slavery is higher than it probably ever has been in a really long time. And then the second thing, because of COVID restrictions, it's really limited our ability to get boots on the ground and sort of eyeball these production facilities and ensure that they meet our standards. So we've done a number of things to try and circumvent these challenges. We've looked at virtual audits, virtual site tours. We've also rolled out a hotline to our supply chain so that workers can contact us directly if they have any challenges and sort of raise those concerns outside of the normal audit standard. But it's a very challenging space to work in at the moment. I think it's probably fair to say, also given the fact that we're all dialing in remotely and not sitting together.
Absolutely. Andy, if I can ask you, what your thoughts are on the difference between the voluntary laws that Australia has and the mandatory laws that are starting to emerge in some other jurisdictions. Do you have any comments on the effectiveness or which direction you see this going in?
Yeah, there's a whole range of ways of tackling a problem like this, and as you say, Ben, things such as the Modern Slavery Act in Australia or in the UK are focused on, so it's obligatory to produce a report, but it's not obligatory to do anything. And so this causes certain challenges, if you like, in trying to actually tackle the underlying problem. And especially when there are so many other activities, whether through regulation or the way that businesses operate, which are constantly fueling the kind of vulnerability of people in the first place, because of low wages, poverty, immigration status, and all these kind of things. So voluntary regulation, which encourages voluntary action like this, is only going to get us so far, clearly. And I think there's been a review recently of the UK Modern Slavery Act, which is a similar structure to the one in Australia. It's weaker, so the one in Australia is definitely a much stronger act in that sense, in terms of what it requires businesses to report on. But the review from the UK is that it's done very little in terms of changing actual business practices on the ground. But it has created awareness, as I think we've already discussed. So there is certainly lots of people are looking at alternatives to this type of regulation, and the one that there's been a lot of attention to recently has been on human rights due diligence type of legislation. which has been introduced in several European countries and is going to be, we think, part of EU regulation more broadly. And human rights due diligence makes it obligatory for companies to evaluate the human rights risks in their supply chains before they make a decision. So they have to do something, right? They have to do a human rights audit of some kind and evaluate what kind of risks they're likely to face. And then if they find a human rights violation, then they also have to remediate it in some way. So this takes the level of compliance up quite a significant level. And something similar to this has been introduced in France and in the Netherlands. So far, the evidence is not, I mean, only for a couple of years, we don't have a lot of evidence on this, but so far the evidence is not particularly compelling that this is a whole lot more effective, to be honest. And it depends how it's introduced, right? This type of legislation can be strong or it can be weak. There's a kind of high road and a low road for human rights due diligence as well, in that it depends how easy it is for whether it's victims or other actors in society to bring a case, for example. This can be made very easy or it can be made quite difficult depending on how the legislation is introduced. And the burden of proof and all these sorts of things can vary. So, you know, I'm not a lawyer, but I've seen some of the legal analysis and there's a lot of variation in terms of how this can happen. So there's a lot of enthusiasm for it. And I think for good reason, because it does, if the Modern Slavery Act has already created awareness, human rights due diligence legislation will create activities for sure. Whether those activities then have the desired effect is another matter, but the activities themselves are important in terms of changing corporate behavior. So it gets us another step on the road. And there are other approaches too, but I don't want to go into too much detail, but in the US, for example, they've gone down the route more of import bans for products that are that they think have forced labor in them. And again, the burden of proof is actually quite low on the government side here. They can restrict the importation of certain goods if they think that they've been made with slave labor. And the burden of proof falls then on the company or on the region or on the country, depending on who it is, to prove that they haven't been made with forced labor. And so that's another approach that's been used. And with recent challenges in Xinjiang in China and accusations of forced labor against the Uyghur people, that's an approach that has happened in the US and has been talked about quite a bit in other countries as well as a potential approach to trying to solve that problem. So, you know, there's different ways of going about this. My preference, though, to be honest, is focusing less on the symptoms, which are forced labor and modern slavery, and actually dealing more with the causes in the first place and trying to ameliorate those.
Well, I have to ask you to elaborate then on that approach.
Yeah, well, there's a whole variety of things, right? But for example, if you look at the United Kingdom at the moment, I'm sure Australia has similar types of situations. We're creating more and more barriers for people to enter the country, right, and work. So if you have immigration rules which make it difficult for people to work in a country, that creates a context where it can be, there's an incentive for people to bring them illegally and then to exploit them once they're there because they're in a very vulnerable situation. So if you're not aligning your modern slavery legislation with your immigration legislation, you're creating a vulnerability that you're then going to prosecute organizations for exploiting, right? And so you need to get these things joined up so that you're not creating a problem that then you're going to try and solve.
Yeah, great. Alex, if I can ask you, do you have you have insights, you're working with different businesses in Australia. You know, what sort of exemplars do you see of businesses doing really sort of cutting edge work from this perspective?
Sure, that's a great question. I think one important thing to acknowledge is that it's really hard. It's challenging for our businesses, and it's challenging for any business at the top of the supply chain for some of the reasons that Laura spoke about. And there's kind of a famous anecdote about an iPhone that the late John Ruggie, who was an academic in business and human rights practitioner, would share about this. And he would say that, you know, if you were holding in his case, it was an iPhone 6, that there's 785 suppliers in 31 countries who are putting into that. And the International Labour Organization suggests that, you know, somewhere between every 1 in 5 and every 1 in 7 workers in the global economy is involved in supply chains in some way. So we're talking about this enormous problem and this enormous pool in which we're asking businesses to search out and find modern slavery. And so the biggest thing we've seen from the Modern Slavery Act over this first year is that it's really hard. And we've also seen that for many businesses, having to talk publicly about human rights and particularly modern slavery is something that's really unfamiliar and something that's really different. And so we did some work for a group of superannuation funds to look at modern slavery reporting by the ASX 200, so our 200 largest public companies here in Australia. And what we found is really that we've seen a race to the middle. So we looked at these statements, we gave them a quality score out of 41. 41 would be, in our view, a really strong statement. And we found the average score was about 15.4, and nobody was scoring over 30. And that just, I think, really reflects the fact that this has been new and tricky for businesses, and we've seen this kind of race to the middle. And a lot of what we've seen are businesses taking some basic steps. So a lot of statements will talk about things like training. So 72% of the ASX 200 have done that. We see a lot of modern slavery issues being addressed in contract clauses. We see technology increasingly being used to think about risk assessments. But the reality is that for most of our corporate sector here and also in places like the UK, we're really stuck at that first level of supply chains, looking at tier 1, and we're trying to work out how to dig past that. And so the reality is that in an Australian context, we've seen much better reporting in quality than the UK because of some differences in our legislation, including mandatory criteria. So businesses actually have to talk about certain things, but we're still not really seeing, in most cases, great practice. But one of the things that we have seen businesses start to do is talk to suppliers and build some actual relationships and conversations with suppliers, rather than simply sending them a piece of paper that says, here's a contract clause or a code of conduct, you should sign it. And that's part of businesses in the Australian context thinking about the ways that they might also impact on modern slavery through their own purchasing practices and engagement with suppliers. So I think that's one positive, that it's been really good to see. But I think the clear message from a lot of external stakeholders who've been looking at statements is, there's a long way to go, and there's some real difficulties in driving business action on this, and those difficulties are real and practical.
Yeah, thank you. Laura, if I can ask you now, so is the Australian government law, is that just outsourcing their responsibilities onto business, making them do all the work? Shouldn't it be government that's policing the harms?
I think all big businesses of Bunnings size or equivalent take this risk and deem it as material. And so I think that if anything, the Modern Slavery Act just prompts us to talk about it publicly, which is can be quite a confronting conversation for some of our board members. So it's really taking them on that journey and being comfortable with that level of transparency. It can be really overwhelming putting information out into the public sphere, particularly on a topic as challenging as human rights and modern slavery, because you never know how your customers and stakeholders are going to take it on board. I think I was sort of reflecting on what Andrew was saying before, and I think modern slavery happens for a lot of reasons, and one of them is sort of a failure of the state to uphold human rights, and that failure doesn't necessarily land on the Australian government's shoulders, but it is inherent within sort of the Modern Slavery Act, and for corporates who have a globalised supply chain and engage hundreds and thousands of supply chain partners globally to fill that void and respond accordingly. So I think it has to be a sort of multi-stakeholder approach to address this issue, because it is, as Alex was alluding to, unbelievably complicated. I think one of the challenges that Alex was talking about is sort of going beyond tier one. So for Bunnings, what that means is we engage a supplier to procure goods. They often engage a third-party manufacturer who then goes and engages raw materials inputs. And then that second tier of manufacturing can sort of be tenfold the size of businesses that we would go to. So our tier one manufacturer is about 980, and we suspect that our tier two level is about 10,000, and that's 10,000 entities. So it really pyramids out. So it's a very challenging space to assess, to scope, and to gain visibility of. And it's really going to take time, and hopefully that's what you'll see with the progression of modern slavery statements, is that maturation curve as businesses become better equipped at dealing with this risk.
Yeah, good. So Andy, you'll have some thoughts on businesses taking on these political responsibilities, but also wanted to ask you, to what extent is this, again, Western nations going into other nations, and is this just another form of cultural imperialism?
That's a tricky one, Ben. Human rights, yes, is in many ways a Western idea, but many of the principles behind it are shared across countries. The UN Declaration on Human Rights has been signed by many, many, many countries. And so there's broad general agreement on these things. Where there may be less agreement is on which ones we prioritize it, under which conditions and in which times. And so, yes, we think that various aspects of this are important, but it is, when we're talking about people who are desperate to work and are willing often to work in situations that we might find deplorable, that clearly are violations of their human rights, right? They're willing to give away their passports, they're willing to be in situations where they might have very restricted freedom of movement, where they may even face threats of various sorts, but they willingly enter, or they appear to willingly enter into this because of desperation. The question comes, who are we to intervene if they've voluntarily entered? And I think if we have labour markets that are free, economists always assume that labour markets are free, then we shouldn't have any problems. But even then, right, even with free labour markets, everybody's entering and leaving the market voluntarily, we still have situations which we want to avoid, right? Nobody says we want more of this. Everyone says we want to have less. And so it does require, it requires us as a society to impose certain restrictions on businesses to prevent these sorts of things from happening, or certain responsibilities of businesses to prevent these things happening. But the challenge then comes when that intersects with local expectations as well. I mean, we've just finished up a piece of work in India, for example, where we were looking at situations in the garment supply chain where workers, particularly young women workers, were locked in to their hostels, which were attached to the mills, the cotton mills that they were working in. And there were guards, they're locked in, they're allowed out sometimes once a week for 3 hours, sometimes once every 2 weeks, once every 3 weeks, always with a warden. Clear violations of a human right. But the more we looked into it as well, we also, when we interviewed the workers and their families outside of the hostel, outside of the workplace, we would interview them after they'd finished working, or after they'd left, or before they'd even gone there, trying to get a sense of what the expectations were here. In these particular parts of the world, there may also be an expectation that this is the way in which you protect women from dangers. In a country like India, which has a lot of gender-based violence, this can be a very real challenge, and also a degree of very patriarchal society where the idea that you must protect women and their dignity in certain ways until they're married is very strong as well. And so there's a kind of expectation that there's going to be a lot of security around the housing for young women. And so it becomes then an expectation that this is what the factories provide. And so then to break that down, yes, it's a violation of a human right, but at the same time, it's kind of demanded. It becomes challenging then for brands, right, in the global supply chain, as well as the local industry actors to find solutions. Because if they do away with these practices, they struggle to recruit young women workers. So they have to find other types of solutions. And so we've been looking at what some of those solutions could be in that situation. And there are, right, different types of housing, different ways of arranging it, but also talking more about how do you change the conditions under which this happens, which is a longer term intervention, of course, but you also have to have an influence on the local culture and the local expectations in the culture to start to do this. And some of that happens through educating the women workers on their rights and these kind of things, but also about getting into local communities and doing deeper rights education on women's rights in particular, this kind of thing, women's empowerment, to try and deal with the underlying problems, not just the kind of symptoms as you discover them.
Yeah, thank you for that. So now we have a little bit of time for Q&A from the audience. So I'd like to invite you to ask any questions, and it might be best, you're across 4 different screens for me, so I'll have to sort of skip between them, but it might be easiest if you do put your hand up. Actually, Jane Fremantle has put her hand up. Jane, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a fascinating discussion, but extremely depressing in some ways. And one of the things I suppose I think about this in the very broad aspect of it is the conditions that are underlying to modern slavery, and particularly the root cause being poverty. And, you know, we talk about how we can eradicate something. We talk about, you know, acknowledging human rights, but until we can actually get some handle on the poverty, it increases the potential for modern slavery, and particularly now with COVID, even in our own communities, we see people desperate for a job. So what are your thoughts about how we address that?
Andy, you've sort of spoken to that before. Would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, Jane. That's the basic answer. Yes, I mean, we have to tackle the underlying causes. So if you're a company, that means, okay, so you have to have a multi-pronged attack to this, right? So one thing to do is to say, okay, what can we do about the situation as we find it? And that involves all the kind of things that Laura was talking about what Bunnings is doing in their supply chain. And then you also have to think about, well, okay, what can we do about these underlying conditions which cause the problems in the first place? And poverty is absolutely the main one. There are many others, you know, including discrimination and what have you, but let's talk about poverty. So what can you do as a company about poverty? Well, there's quite a lot, actually, you know, that you can start to have an influence on. So things such as commitments to a living wage, right? So that at least the people that are in your supply chain are going to be paid in a way that means they can survive properly. There may be ways in which you can work with local actors to start dealing with more structural poverty in regions that you source from. But, you know, this takes a long-term commitment to a certain region. So for some companies that continue to source from the same region, whatever it might be, further down their supply chain, it might be, let's say, a mining area, there can be, you know, ways in which you can go about trying to tackle poverty in that region so that you don't have artisanal miners working in terrible conditions, trying to dig up coltan or whatever else it might be in the supply chain that feeds into electronics products. but these things you can't do alone, right? You don't want companies running off solving poverty, because that's not what they're best at. That's not what they're designed to do. They can make a contribution, and they can work with others to do that. They can even take a lead potentially, but it's not something that they're built to do and to do effectively. But to solve this problem, they have to get involved in that.
Thanks. Andrew Gourlay has a question.
Thanks, Ben. A question mainly for Andy. We live in a globalised world, and these big, for instance, the apparel businesses are sourcing their products from third world countries, if I'm allowed to say that. So that's a complexity, and it's hard for a business to control to the nth degree what's happening down the chain. But having said that, even within Australia, we're a modern society and we have good labour laws and a fair work system that looks after people. However, I work in the food manufacturing business, and actually next door to me in South Oakley is an embroidery, and they do T-shirts and pens and promo type equipment. It's run by a Chinese couple, and every one of the employees is a Chinese national. I know for a fact that they're paid a flat rate, and they work Saturdays and they sometimes work Sundays if they're busy. So his labour costs are lower than what anyone else's would be if they're paying per award. And secondly, in Australia, the fruit and veg industry has had some issues with paying people below award, and more recently we've had problems with actually finding the arms and legs to pick the fruit because of COVID and so on. I suppose it's a conundrum for business, but it's also a massive ethical, important ethical decision for consumers to, you see something that's half the price than it normally is, and there's a big incentive for you, me, and everyone else to go, well, if I can pay half the price, I'll grab it. So yeah, it's what are your thoughts on that sort of down the consumer end of the spectrum in terms of effectively they are manifesting or allowing that slavery to happen because they are buying those products that are over more expensive products?
Andy, I'll just ask you to be brief on this because we've got other people wanting to ask questions and time is quickly running out.
Sure. I mean, I'm sure if we did a poll of everyone on this call and asked them, would you be willing to spend, for every shirt that you buy, would you be willing to spend an extra 20 cents more and be sure that it's free of slavery? Everyone would say yes. The consumer expectations and demand is there, but then when you go to actually increasing the price and giving consumers the choice, do you want the cheap shirt or the expensive shirt that guarantees the no slavery, then they go for the cheaper one, right? And this consistently happens across a whole range of ethical issues. And so I think we have to take it into account what consumers want and what they desire and what they think is right is no slavery in the supply chain. What they're willing to pay at any particular time may be quite different. And so it becomes a requirement, I think, for governments or for firms to take that responsibility away from consumers, because we can't expect consumers to make that choice all the time. If we don't think slavery should be in the supply chain, then we need to stop it happening at source, not just say, well, how much is it worth to you to not have slavery in the supply chain as a consumer? Because I think that's the wrong approach.
That's great. Helen Steele, do you have a question?
Thank you, Ben. And, you know, a terrific conversation, and of course, not enough time to explore all the aspects of it. I've got a question for Laura. And what I've heard that, you know, embarking on making a commitment to being a signature of the Modern Slavery Act in Australia and producing a statement every year. From Bunnings' perspective, I mean, is it a worthwhile exercise? I mean, we've heard a lot of the downside, but has there been sort of any positive attribution to Bunnings?
Absolutely. I think if I put my sort of commercial business hat on, that doesn't fit very well, but I tend to wear it from time to time. It has provided us a really good stead to see through really challenging events like COVID. And by what I mean, through our ethical sourcing program, we have really deep relationships with our suppliers. We don't tend to shop around a lot. We just tend to stick with people that we've worked with for a number of years. And through that long-term engagement, we've been working with them to slowly lift standards. And so that we know through our program where our products are coming from and under which conditions they're being manufactured. And that really provided quite substantial business benefit when COVID struck and supply chains got quite severely disrupted and production peaks were impacted and shipping lines were impacted because of those really clear and robust relationships. We had a reasonably strong supply of goods where we know particularly a lot of our commercial competitors didn't have those kind of relationships. So it's absolutely not only a moral and a values-led benefit for having an ethical sourcing program, there's real business benefit as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Now, I am aware that it is just about 7 o'clock, but there does seem to be quite a bit of interest in continuing the conversation. So, you know, we're happy to continue for a little bit. And Ken, I hope you're happy to hold off from the wrap up. I'll just go to a question that was in the chat from Diana Telford. So, and possibly, Alex, this might be a good one for you, or perhaps for Andy. In due diligence for modern slavery and human rights, have you seen good models prioritising country, sector, supplier spend hotspots?
Well, perhaps something I think that's interesting to throw into the conversation is the role of technology, and say there's a whole human rights, business and human rights framework that sits behind this kind of legislation. It says, as Laura alluded to before, that countries have the primary obligation to protect human rights, but businesses do have an expectation that they'll respect human rights. And one of the ways that we're really seeing that manifested is by businesses and other stakeholders looking at technology and things like blockchain, and how does that work? Are there ways that we can kind of crack through some of the difficulties with identifying suppliers down supply chains and thinking about risks? Are there algorithms we can use to identify geographies or sectors that are higher risk, and are there ways that we can plug all that together? So I think that's a really interesting piece of the conversation to consider.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
And I'm very pleased to, sorry, Andy, I was just going to say that I'm very pleased that the University of Melbourne has engaged with the other universities in Australia through the Australian Universities Procurement Network to come together to actually buy a white label technology platform to help them identify modern slavery in their supply chains. Andy, sorry.
Yeah, just one thing on that. I completely agree with Alex. And you know, when you're starting off on this journey as a company, the crucial place to start is to find your hotspots, right? Because you know, when you've got 950 suppliers like Bunnings does, you can't know everything about all those suppliers, right? You have to focus on which ones are the priority ones you're going to look at, where the risk is highest. And you know, there are plenty. You know, some of the good news here is there's plenty of consultancies out there who are making a business out of things such as human rights risk mapping, where you can go to consultancies or you can get proprietary platforms to do some of this for you. You know, you don't have to like make all this stuff up from scratch as well. And that does help to start thinking about some of these root causes as well, because it's that the hotspots are those where you have most people who are in vulnerable situations, right? So it depends on what we already know about what industries are out there where there's most vulnerability, but also what groups of workers are most vulnerable. So you're not alone when you start off on this, and starting with the hotspots is crucial.
Yeah, fantastic. Julie Foreman, the last question.
Thank you. This is for Alex. The ASX Governance Principle 3 requires listed companies to act lawfully, ethically and responsibly. They need to report to those principles as part of their corporate governance statement. Is there any scope for including the modern slavery report in that statement?
I think that's a great example of kind of one of the ways that an obligation like that might have a practical outworking, which is in the modern slavery context. And I think, and perhaps this is a good note to conclude on, but while this is a really grim issue in many ways, I think 4 or 5 years ago, we probably wouldn't be having a conversation about ASX reporting and ethical principles. And certainly, 5 years ago, modern slavery wasn't a term that businesses were using day to day. And so I think we're in a much more positive place than we were then. And I think the more that companies think about questions like yours, Julie, the quicker that we'll see progress.
Thanks.
Yeah, so a wonderful way to finish there, Alex. Thanks for bringing that together. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is an issue, that is very serious, and yet it is wonderful to see, the Australian government and Australian business coming together to really work positively on this, and in a way, collaborating together in a way that we don't see on climate change, for example. So I think that we should feel quite pleased that we're on the path to really making this in dealing with this issue far better than we have in the past. So thank you all to all the panelists, and thank you for the people who especially asked the questions. I'm now very pleased to hand over to the Warden, Ken Hinchcliffe, for the wrap up.
Ben, thank you, and thank you all. It's been an excellent discussion of an important topic, and Andy, of course, you provided a fireside chat on this for the students of the residential college earlier this year, and it was just as thrilling this time around as it was that time. It's reassuring that large businesses see this as a material risk, and that was identified by Laura. And I was amazed to discover that my phone has 750 suppliers, and Bunnings has over 900 suppliers. Andy gave us a way through that by saying that we should really be looking to identify the hotspots, not work with all those suppliers, and to act on those suppliers. And furthermore, that we can't rely on us as consumers to drive this process, and it really through our purchasing power, but it really must be legislated. I think there were some really important messages coming through tonight. I'm really very grateful for this year's Gourlay Visiting Professor in Business Ethics, Andy Crane, joining us from the University of Bath. Andy, thank you for giving up your morning to join us. And also to our panelists, Alex Coward of Pillar 2 and Laura Gaspert, who's the head of ethical sourcing at Bunnings. You provided some valuable contributions. And of course, Ben Neville. Ben pulled this together. Ben's the Gourlay Fellow in Business Ethics in the Faculty of Business and Economics, and he's an associate professor. And Ben, thank you for organising this. We really do appreciate your ongoing contribution to this program. Importantly and excitingly, I'd like to let you know all about the development that we mentioned earlier. Over the years, the Gourlay Foundation has allowed Trinity and the University of Melbourne to bring a veritable who's who of leading lights in business ethics to Melbourne. We saw one of them tonight. So next year, in recognition of Trinity's 150th anniversary and also the continuing support of this visiting professorship by the Gourlay Foundation, we're inviting nearly all of the previous Gourlay visiting professors back to join us in Trinity in Melbourne at the University of Melbourne in May 2022 for a week-long series of events devoted to business ethics. These will be largely public events, and we're looking forward to putting together quite a panel, important panel. I think there's about a dozen or 10 visiting professors will be joining us, and a week-long series of events. I'll be coming back to you with more details about that in the coming months. It is, of course, COVID dependent, as is everything these days. But so much, I enjoyed so much seeing you all here this evening. I hope we can do the next one of these in person and stand around and have a glass of wine and a chat afterwards. But as we can't, I wish you all a good evening and thank you all. And finally, a very sincere thank you again to the Gourlay family for making this possible. Couldn't happen without you. Good evening.